Okay, share screen. Okay. Okay, so thank you very much for joining me. Good afternoon. This is obviously a novel experience for all of us. But I'm going to try and talk about the question of how women in Wales were seen during the First World War, and literally seen. How they were visible as contributing to the war. In terms of theory, I'm tying it into the question of the visual turn, which is a phrase which I hope that people will have come across. The idea that historians have not traditionally engaged very much, or a lot of historians haven't engaged with visual sources, and when they have, perhaps just use them as illustrations rather than sources in their own right. So what I'm trying to do here is basically I've collected some interesting evidence, and I'm trying to think what to do with it and how to analyze it, and what messages we can get out of these collections, these collections of photographs in particular. Paul Betts, it says here, you need to do more than just look at the image and say, oh, that's nice. You need to, to take it seriously. You need to analyze it, thinking about origins, intentions, style, genre, and audience. I suppose I'm looking a lot here in terms of audience, how the general public understood these images at the time. And be focusing perhaps in terms of how they fitted into the general discourse of the war, the recruiting discourse in particular. Basically, I'll be suggesting that a lot of these images are geared towards getting young men to do their bit. So even though they're images of women, they have a purpose of boosting recruitment of men into the armed forces. And I'll be pondering questions of meaning. What do these images mean? And of course, what they meant at the time is a difficult thing to get a handle on. And how were they understood at the time? But I'll be offering some interpretation and my analysis of what these images and how they were understood by the audience, by the people that saw them at the time. This is a starting point, which is an image which I'm sure First World War historians will have seen this. You may have seen it perhaps during the centenary period. An image produced by the Parliamentary Recruiting Committee, which is quite obviously geared towards recruitment, towards getting young men to enlist, to volunteer, of course, because this is the early part of the war when it was volunteers rather than conscription. And so there are messages in this image which are perhaps not obvious to us today. In fact, it wasn't obvious to me until I read about it that this lady here is Belgian. The audience at the time would have understood that she, the mother there, is a Belgian, a refugee, someone who has been displaced by the war and come over to Britain. So there are messages within this image which are not obvious to us in the 21st century, but which were understood at the time. But obviously this has the message of urging the women to let their men go, not just let their men go, but to encourage their men, their brothers or sons or husbands, to volunteer, to do their duty. And so, this is one example, quite well known, of the women being used explicitly to boost recruitment. Here's another one from 1915, which, an Irish example, obviously, which again has a similar message, perhaps shaming the men into going, in this instance, the man there who's unarmed, with his got his walking stick with him, hands in his pockets, as opposed to the woman, with the hair flowing in the wind, who has the rifle and is pointing towards ravaged Belgium. Will you go, or must I? And this, okay, I'm using this image in particular because this was the image that came to my mind when I saw this image in the Swansea newspaper, the Cambria Daily Leader, from 1915. It instantly struck me the parallel between this official recruiting image, shaming the man in the picture there into volunteering, and this young girls, well, I don't know, guessing they're 12, 13 years old maybe, with the poster saying, yeah, if you won't go, we must. They're wearing military caps. One of them obviously saluting to the camera. A very striking image, I think, and very much shaming any young man looking at that in 1915 into thinking that, well, perhaps he should be doing his duty. This is the headline that goes with it: Swansea girls as recruiting sergeants, and it tells us, yeah, this is a march organised with the Swansea District Band of Hope Union, so the St Philip's Band of Hope girls. And yeah, I think this is a very striking image, which to me tells a lot about how people in Swansea were mobilising themselves, if you like, to boost the recruiting rate from Swansea, and yeah, how young girls were part of it, and yeah, at one point a very feminine image, but then again they're like wearing military caps. Yeah, it is a very very powerful, I think, for any young man who would have seen that at the time. And yeah, another example of seeing women in Swansea in unfamiliar circumstances. This comes from January 1916, where for the first time there are female window cleaners. And this notes, their uniforms are of natty blue and red. It's it shows how the visual sphere had changed. Of course, which is one thing where the evidence is so patchy. We don't have evidence of what people saw from day to day. Obviously, we are just left with photographs, and obviously in this case photographs in the newspapers to tell us how things which were thought noteworthy, things which were thought worthy of being included in the newspaper. So yeah, this is an example of something which would have been unprecedented beforehand, but now you can see women taking on jobs which were closed to them previously. Okay, so going back to the start of the war. The war was seen very quickly in the newspapers, literally seen. Throughout the early months of the war, the South Wales Daily News had one page of photographs of war-related photographs. Different title every day, but right from the start of the war, you'd have this format of maybe half a dozen and a dozen photographs related either to things happening on the fighting front or things happening on the home front. And so, yeah, very, very quickly, the war is seen in Wales. It is part of the visual sphere straight away. Obviously, depending on where you were in Wales, you might well see the war yourself. You would see soldiers being mobilised, or see soldiers on route marches. Route marches, of course, being a way not just of keeping soldiers fit and getting them trained, but also as recruiting drives, going a route march through villages and towns in order to encourage more young men to join up. So even in these early days, there are examples of women who are contributing, but these are they're very constrained, if you like, by traditional roles in these early months. So you have women knitting, for example, yeah, or packing comforts here for the soldiers. So in the early months, it is very much a traditional image of women as providers, as mothers, as carers. That is what and how they are involved, how they're mobilised in the early months of the war. And then you get the other example coming in quite quickly of yeah, the family image, where the family is praised. Yeah, few families are more loyal and patriotic than that of Mr. and Mrs. James McCarthy. So you have a photograph there of the mother and father, and then a photograph of the 4 sons who are now serving with the army. And this becomes trope. This becomes something you see time after time in the newspapers throughout this period. The mothers and fathers being praised for doing their duty. Yeah, the proud family or the proud mother is a figure that appears time and again in a whole range of newspapers throughout this period. And so, yeah, many photographs such as these, group photographs with the mother in the centre or being prominent in the picture, and quite often being explicitly praised as well. Proud mother is a phrase which appears time after time in these newspapers. Where, yeah, so like this boosts the message that the mothers are participating as well. They are, by urging their sons to do their duty, they are part of this communal war effort. So they're visible, they are seen being retained. I like quantitative analysis, so I have a database of over 2,200 images of named individuals in the South Wales Echo from this period, November 1914 to July 1915. And the first thing to note is how the named individuals who are praised for their contribution to the war, it's obviously dominated by men. 2,200 males, 31 females. And so it's always a minor current. And yeah, I think we have to accept that. It is not, this is something that dominates the so I'm talking here about the page in the South Wales Echo where they have individual portraits, mostly often studio portraits of servicemen who have who are either serving or who sometimes have been killed or wounded, and done something noteworthy to be mentioned in the newspaper. So this is an example here where you see row after row of faces of young men. And then at the bottom here, you will see Mrs. Purcell and her 4 sons who were serving as soldiers. And so, so this is what I mean. That the women are present, but we have to accept that they are a minor thread in the numerically in this in these photographs, these page after page of photographs. This is how it divides up in terms of the different categories. So mothers appear quite frequently throughout the period. So this is the proud mother narrative, if you like, the proud family or proud mother narrative, where she is praised for her part in encouraging sons to be volunteered. And then we also have some examples of nurses, yeah, fairly consistently through the period. And then there are occasional examples of brides or wives being photographed, and yeah, so the bride and groom. So the groom being a serving soldier, and you'll have the wedding photograph with his bride, who's of course well, letting him go, if you like, letting him go front. There is only in this period one example of munitions, and that is one group photograph of 4 munitions workers. The others are quite interesting. There's some, one example is actually the landlady of the Neptune pub in Cardiff, which was a prime recruiting centre. And so there's a photograph of her and her husband being praised for the number of men that they have recruited for the army. So that is, if like, the spread of the different kinds of things they fall under. Okay, so to look at yeah, the example of nursing, and here we have here we have both. We have both the proud mother and the nurse. So this is like 2 of the prices. One, Mrs. Jenkins Morriston. In fact, yeah, this appeared not only in the South Wales Echo, also appeared in the Cambria Daily Leader and the Herald of Wales. So you have yeah, the example where yeah, Mrs. Jenkins Morriston is praised and is called a proud mother because 6 sons, a soldier, and in the middle here, the daughter is a nurse. And yeah, we have many examples through this period. And yeah, the language here, ministering angels. This is very traditional, isn't it, in terms of women seen as carers, seen as being caring for their well, caring for their menfolk, in this case caring for the wounded soldiers. And yes, some examples here from South Wales Echo. And then moving to Swansea, there are some further examples in Swansea. This is one interesting example. Elizabeth Clement from Landor, Swansea, who has numerous reports about her in the press and in the Swansea newspapers, basically because she volunteered to serve with the with the Serbian soldiers. And she had a bit of a torrid time, went out to the Serbian front, got captured by the Austrians, and then eventually was released and came back home. And when she came back home, we see her here in Serbian costume. Heroic Landor nurses return. So yeah, we see her both, if you like, in the traditional nurse's costume, the traditional uniform here, and in this exotic Serbian uniform. And as I say, there's lots about her in the newspapers, extracts from her diary, serialized. So yeah, it is one example of yeah, someone who does make a splash, who is seen as, literally seen as being a participant in the war. And then, yeah, plenty of examples around Wales, and very much within this narrative of patriotism. This is the way it is conveyed. This is the way the newspaper editors want it to be understood. Yeah, and this ill patriotic family. And here we are, Sister A. Wilson Jones is one of the, well, the daughter of the family who is doing her bit. And yeah, as I say, you can find it. Obviously, we are very fortunate here that the Welsh newspapers have been digitized, so you can just browse through them, and you will find amongst the hundreds of photographs of men, a smattering of photographs of women in uniform who are seen as being contributing. Two more examples here. Yeah, going up to Aberystwyth and North Wales. Go through to yeah, and then when they, well, this is an example, Annie Roach from Swansea, who was well, died of enteric fever while serving in Yarmouth. And yeah, Swansea Girl's Sacrifice. We have a quite a sizable photograph of her here. On the same page, I presume, as photographs of men, servicemen who have died. You have a large photograph of her, Swansea Girl's Sacrifice. So, so that's how it's portrayed, and that is the kind of language used. It fits in. I call it the language of 1914. It fits in with the language of duty, honour, sacrifice. Yeah, they are doing their bit here, and this all fits in within the recruiting and volunteering narrative. In terms of when they are seen otherwise, this is of course an area where the sources are tricky, you know, in terms of how they are literally seen at the time. You know, if they're not photographed, how do we know? But there are some examples here. A lot of weddings become militarized occasions in this period. You will find an awful lot of khaki weddings or military weddings in the newspaper. And this is an interesting example where we have the bride is so the groom is serving in the RAMC, the Royal Army Medical Corps, and the bride is a nurse. And so she has a guard of honor of Red Cross nurses, which, yeah, perhaps we could you know, think of it in terms of a visible display of these nurses, yeah, demonstrating that they too are contributing to the war effort. As I say, the evidence here, it is problematic because we have to imagine it. But you know, there are examples such as this of you know, of women making themselves visible. We see further examples now of women making themselves visible in the public sphere in Swansea and around Wales. Okay. Just to say that, okay, as well as the nurses in uniform, another way that women could volunteer and could serve and could be seen to be wearing a uniform was with the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. And this was established late 1916. So you see an example here where you have a family, a patriotic family from Porthmadog that have you know, 3 sons serving in uniform, and then one daughter who is a nurse and one daughter who is serving with the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. I can tell you that in the Swansea newspapers, I found 7 named nurses in photographs. Some of them whose photograph is included more than once, but there's 7 named women nurses in the Swansea newspapers and 1 named Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. So for Swansea, that gives you an idea of how frequently they were seen in that sphere. But they do crop up, yeah, in in the other newspapers. This is the example. So this is Theo Mason. This is the one who is seen in Swansea. And yeah, one of the first from Swansea to join the Women's Army or Auxiliary Corps. And you see this, yeah. Photograph of Miss Mason is reproduced to give some idea of the smart uniform that the WAAC girls wear. So this is, again, has a recruiting narrative, doesn't it? This is like urging the young women of Swansea, well, you too could have a natty uniform like this. You too could volunteer and be seen to be doing your bit. And so, yeah, I say, even though this is a minor flow within the Swansea newspapers, there are references, there are other examples of letters from women who served for the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps in the newspapers, and usually portraying it as a bit of an advantage, to be honest, portraying it as yeah, not only are you doing your bit for a country, but you're you're having an excitement while you're doing it. So this, yeah, very much fits in with the recruitment narrative. Okay, this is an example, not from a newspaper, from a private collection. Lillian Hopkins from Bryn Mill, Swansea, yeah, and so her private collection, again, wearing a rather natty uniform here, being seen, you know, in the studio photo, the posed studio photograph. That's something I'll be flagging up in a minute. Yeah, so we have here a posed studio photograph of Lillian with two of her friends. Yeah, we can imagine, there's no proof of it in this case, but we can imagine that this was up on the family mantelpiece. In this case, Lillian did have a brother who was serving, he was actually captured and a POW, serving on the Western Front. So you can imagine that in this case, they would be Lillian in uniform on one side of the mantelpiece, her brother on the other. Okay, we're having to use some conjecture there, but that gives an example of how in the private sphere, this contribution might well have been visible at the time. Okay, munitions workers. I mentioned that there's only one photograph I've seen in the South Wales Echo, or sorry, one day then, when there are photographs of munition workers, and this is it, May 1915, 4 ladies from Nelson, who are, yeah, not only are the men of Nelson responding to the country's call, but the ladies are also willing to do their share. So again, it's fitting in with the recruitment narrative. And yeah, 4 ladies there who were doing their bit country in 1915. There are no named munition workers in Swansea newspapers, in photographs. So there are named munition workers in news reports, but no photographs of named munition workers that I've seen in the Swansea newspapers. But there is this tremendous photo here. Welsh girl munition workers. A group of happy girl munition workers were employed at a local works. Well, and I need to say, this is, again, urging young women to do their bit, to join up. And look at these happy girls, having a good time, doing their bit. Yeah, on the front page here of the Cumbria Daily Leader. So, yeah, I think that this is again further evidence of the visibility of this. There were various factories in the Southwest Wales area, factories within Swansea itself, and then very important munitions works in Pembrey, just west of Llanelli, where thousands of women worked, and including many who travelled from Swansea to Pembrey. So in fact, you would see them on the trains. You would literally see munition workers on the trains travelling west from Swansea to Pembrey, or maybe east from Carmarthen to Pembrey. So yeah, they were visible. They were seen at the time. And here are some really interesting examples. So one from my family collection. Here is my great aunt Annie. So Annie Matthews here in the munitionettes uniform, and I can tell you that just as the family had a photograph like this of Annie in her uniform, there's a photograph of her brother, her elder brother Tom, who was in his Southern Forces uniform. So in that case, you can very much imagine that there was a photograph of her next in uniform next to a photograph of him in uniform. And then we have these really interesting examples here. So Edith May Jacquet, another one from Swansea. Again, wearing her munitionettes uniform here. And here, having borrowed a man's uniform, and borrowed a soldier's uniform, and wearing it in a studio photograph. Similarly, great Auntie Annie here, wearing a borrowed uniform, and again, a posed studio photograph. I interpret these as declarations that, look at me, here I am, I'm contributing. So they are, literally drawing comparison between their contribution to the war and their, brothers, or in this case, Edith, her sweetheart, and her father were both serving. So, yeah, they're basically making a declaration here, just as our menfolk are serving, we are serving as well. So yeah, I think these are interesting examples of being visible, like in the family home, as statements of their contribution to the war. There is one interesting example of a public display of munitions workers in Swansea, explicitly female munitions workers, and explicitly a display of a mourning, a display of mourning, but it's also a display of, look at us, look at our contribution. So here is the news report from the South Wales Daily Post. It follows an accident at the munitions factory in Pembrey on the last day of July 1917, in which I think 6 or so munition workers were killed, including 2 young ladies from Swansea. They were young, Mildred Owens, 18, Dorothy Watson, 19. And here is the report of the funeral cortege, the funeral procession through the centre of Swansea. And yeah, great crowds lined High Street from the DWR station over to St Thomas Bridge, and all traffic was held up to allow the cortege to pass. Heading the funeral procession were the heroines' fellow workers, most of them carrying the holdall by which all munition girls have come to be recognised. All right, so that's how you understand your munitions girl. She carries a certain type of canvas holdall. And yeah, the hearses were escorted by girls in munitions uniform, who acted as bearers while the floral tributes were exceedingly beautiful. And here we are, photograph of the procession. I don't know whether it is Mildred Owen or Dorothy Mary Watson who is in the coffin here, but look, the coffin has the Union flag draped around it. And yeah, so you have these, the cortege, her fellow workers marching either side of the hearse. So it's like a military funeral. It has the pomp and circumstance of a military funeral, visible right through the centre of town. And we also have a photograph here showing, well, her co-workers, the co-workers of the deceased munition worker, and yeah, literally hundreds of them walking in line. It was a bank holiday Monday, and here they are, visible, marching through the centre of Swansea, so everyone knows about their contribution, their sacrifice, indeed. Okay, moving to the question of memorialisation. How is this seen later? And of course, most memorials, which have a kind of visual imagery, well, it's very often you will have a soldier. That is the most common type of statue you would have. Obviously, there are some with crosses or obelisks, but in terms of statuary, you would very often have a soldier. Of course, Britannia is another figure, female figure who very often appears in these war memorials. But yeah, in terms of military imagery, you'd have the soldier. Sometimes, so here's an example: the stained glass window in Manorbier Church in Pembrokeshire, and a very evocative image. Christ on the cross in the centre, and then on one side you have these sailors and soldiers, and on the other side more soldiers and a nurse in uniform. So the nurse is seen in this post-war example of commemoration. The nurse is seen as being one of the contributors, as having contributed to the war effort. And there are other examples around Wales. Here are some. Mountain Ash has on the plinth here. Well, we have the Britannia figure at the top, and then on each side of the plinth there is an image of someone who contributed, and one of the sides has a nursing figure. And in Miskin, again, 4 images on the pillar, and the soldier, the sailor, the airman, and the nurse. There are examples where in these civic memorials where they are seen, they're seen as having contributed. And here are a couple of examples I particularly like. These are not that common, or at least they haven't survived very well. But chapel memorials sometimes had images of everyone who served on them, and sometimes they had images of those just those who died. But there may be 9 or 10 examples where you have images of everyone from a chapel who served being remembered in the photographs. And here we have in Rosciana Llygog near Wrexham, Mount Pleasant English Baptist, 4 ladies, 4 nurses amongst the dozens of men. And then Tabernacle, Newbridge, there are, it's more than this actually, there are 2 memorials with photographs on them. And one of them, one nurse, sadly not named in this case, which is slightly annoying, but we see here how they are remembered. They are commemorated as having been part of the war effort. So, drawing to a conclusion, I think gathering all this evidence, it shows quite clearly that there were many examples, particularly in the early years of the war, where women are used to encourage men to enlist, either by shaming them, in the example of the Irish recruiting poster and the girls marching through Swansea, or in terms of appealing to the mother to let her sons go, or to encourage her husband to go, perhaps. And of course, that is throughout the period, as we saw in the examples from the South Wales Echo, there are examples of proud mothers being highlighted as having done their bit, as having contributed. So yeah, ideas of duty and patriotism, which is all fitting within the narrative of recruitment. the discourse which is encouraged, is talking about, you know, loyalty, duty, patriotism, sacrifice. This is how it fits in. And women are visible. We can only glimpse it in some of these photographs, but we can also read it sometimes in the newspapers how they were visible. And they were visible in some circumstances which were perhaps feminine, such as nurses, the traditional sphere of the woman as a carer, but also in very radically different spheres, the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps and the munitions workers. And yeah, there's that evidence from 1917 of the munitions workers making their presence felt. That wasn't the only one, by the way. I don't have any photographs, but I know that in the some of the processions at the end of the war to celebrate the peace or to celebrate the armistice, munitions workers were marched as a block in those processions. So they were making a declaration there at the end of the war. Hey, we've been part of this as well. So their part, it was visible, but then again, in terms of numbers, if you do a quantitative analysis, you have to see that it is a minor thread. So obviously there are there are examples which run through the whole period, but it's always outnumbered by the men in uniform. So in fact it complements that, if you like, rather than challenging it. Okay, I think that's where I'm going to stop speaking now, and I hope that you've enjoyed it, and I'll invite you to ask me some questions.